Matchless have pulled off a real hat trick with this amp. They have distilled the sound of a huge 100 watt Marshall into this tiny box. Hey everyone, this is Karlis from Amalgam Audio, and in today's episode of Storytime we're going to take a look at a very special Matchless amp. That's the Coldwater Canyon. After having played through over something like 200 amps, it's actually quite hard to be surprised by any piece of gear, and being surprised is something that happens really seldom nowadays for me. But this little amp was really a big surprise in a lot of ways. So from what I understand, Matchless went with this design for the kind of a Eddie Van Halen hot-rodded Marshall sound. They did it on a platform which is based on a pair of 6v6 tubes, which is not the typical thing that we would get for a Marshall kind of sound. But what is amazing is that this small amp with those small tubes really gets close to that kind of sound. And it's almost scary how close it gets to those authentic Marshall tones. Of course, it won't sound one-to-one like a real super lead Plexi set to a brown sound kind of a thing with a variac running in front of it and dialing down the voltage a bit. A part of this sound is the amp is starting to cave into itself, so that's not something that it does. It kind of keeps it together really well up to really high gain levels, but it gets this Marshall vibe over like nothing else I've ever tried. And I've been through a couple of Marshall-inspired American amps that approach those sounds with 6L6 tubes or 6v6 tubes, and they are often really nice designs, but they usually end up still sounding more like an American amp, or like an American take on a British sound, which is usually the case. But you would never guess that this amp is a Matchless, or that is running on a rather typically American bass, so to speak. This little thing is really a fire-breathing monster, and unlike a lot of other amps that are based on those smaller tubes like 6v6s or EL84 tubes, this has all the frequency bandwidth that you would ever wish for. It doesn't sound hollowed out like some of the smaller amps can sound in comparison to the bigger specimen. It has a lot of tight low end. It is very defined on the top end. It must also be said, this amp is inherently bright. There is no way how you can dial the brightness out of it, basically. What is rather unusual for this amp, and the same holds true also for the Coldwater Canyon, which is the other recently released smaller format Matchless amp, is that the tone stack, which also includes mids and treble, works in a way that the treble controls basically the high trebles, like the really, really high frequencies, and the mids control is voiced rather closer to what you would normally feel as a treble control. So basically the mid knob controls mids along with a big portion of the treble. So, and if you have a tone that is too bright, you have to dial back some of the mids. And at some point, of course, you run into some sort of a compromise where you cannot dial down the mids further because it starts to sound a bit too scooped. And there's a point, I think it's about 5 on the dial, maybe 4, where you cannot really go lower than that. That means that that sound will still remain quite bright, but you will still have enough mids content in your tone. With the master control on 10, it will sound really bright, punchy, and very detailed. It will have a big amp sound. There's no way you would ever tell that it is a 6v6 amp. So when going for a lead tone, which is obviously my first choice, what I would like to do with this amp, to go for the kind of Van Halen inspired thing, you can go with the gain as high as about 8 on the dial. It will still sound really defined and punchy and quite controlled and actually quite tight. And that's still with the master at 10, so it is really amazing what they pulled off with this one, especially in regard to the output section of the amp. The volume control will adjust how much signal goes into the next gain stage, so that's another place where you can tailor your tone a bit. As we're going for a lead tone, we don't need a lot of bass, and this amp has surprising amounts of low end, so you don't really need more than 0 in this case. But it is easy to get some punchier and bass heavy sounds out of this amp, because the bass remains still quite tight. And that is a really unusual feature for an amp this size, so it's basically a 20 watt amp, and that is quite an amazing feature. What is also unique with this amp is when you dial it up for even lead level of gain, you can use the volume control on your guitar to get to the cleaner tones, and it will clean up perfectly in a way how not many amps are capable of doing it. And as this is an inherently bright amp, you do not need a lot of treble. It would actually sound really okay with treble at 0. That's where you would put it for single coil guitars. For humbuckers, it's fine to go to about 3. You don't need much more than that. And for the mids, it sounds really good with mids at 8 or a bit below, but it might start to sound also a bit too bright because it also dials in some of the lower trebles. And so I like to put the mids somewhere about 6 or thereabouts for a humbucker guitar. Okay, so we're dialed in a face-melting lead sound with this little monster. Let's check out how it sounds with a humbucker-equipped guitar. So Fabian will play us out with some really mean rock riffs on this rock machine. Like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy what we do here, and see you around.